colleague, Professor Jessica Zychowicz, who received PhD in Slavic Studies from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. And she is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Alberta in the Contemporary Ukrainian Studies program at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. Most recently, she was U.S. Fulbright Scholar based at Kyiv-Mohyla University, teaching visual culture while researching the cultural history of computing technology in Kyiv, Ukraine. Her first monograph, titled Superfluous Women, Feminism, Art, and Revolution in 21st Century Ukraine, is in progress at University of Toronto Press. She's co-editing a series at the academic journal Kritika, on questions of race and post-colonialism. Today, her lecture, entitled The Unknown Uncut Story of Your Feminist Friends You Have Not Met, draws, quote, from Jessica, on literature, film, dissident manifestos, performances, art exhibits, news media, and official documents, and explores her, quote, ongoing research that seeks a better understanding of the development of oppositional movements in the framework of revolution, theories of democracy, and the linkages and shifts between feminism, nationalism, and globalism, end of the quote. This event is sponsored by the Gender Studies, and I'm very grateful to Professor Lisa Corrigan, who is not here, for supporting and inviting Jessica Zychowicz here, as well as I'm grateful to Professor Luis Fernando Restrepo, the head of the program in comparative literature. In addition to today's event, tomorrow at 5 p.m. at Au Bon Pain Cafe, instead of our regular The Nose, the Russian conversation, Jessica will teach us Ukrainian. So I think you need to switch a little bit to different Slavic languages. So to entice you to that event, you will get a free sandwich and a drink from Au Bon Pain that is going to be sponsored by Luis Fernando Restrepo. Okay, so please help me welcome Jessica. But before we start welcoming her, I want to promote our other event that my students from the Russian Eurasian Student Organization put together. They worked very hard to invite a colleague from University of Oklahoma, Emily Johnson, who is coming on Wednesday, April 17 at 6 p.m., and she's going to talk about Gulag letters as a window on Soviet private life in the Stalin period, and her lecture is going to be in Science and Engineering Building, room 403. So April 17, 6 p.m., Emily Johnson from University of Oklahoma. If you're interested in Russian classes, there are some elementary levels next fall, as well as literature course that explores Russian and Jewish writers that is entitled Russia's Races. So we'll explore the question of race in the Russian Empire. So there's a small bookmark for you. So, and now I will turn to Jessica. So please help me welcome Jessica.
Thank you guys so much. Thank you for having me here. It's really, really exciting to be in Arkansas because I have never been to this particular region of the U.S. I've traveled through almost every other region of our country except for here. But I've always wanted to come here. Why? Because I have a very, very, very close friend who is from Arkansas. And I incorporated her into my presentation today, so that's part of the inspiration for my title, Your Feminist Friends I Haven't Met Yet, because one of my feminist friends is a big part of why I have wanted to visit your state. And I hope to hear from some of you guys about what to do while I'm here, because I'm here for 5 whole days. So I have a little bit of time to explore whatever kind of ideas or inspirations you can give me would be really exciting. So to start, let's see, I guess I just need to switch over to, yeah, okay, so let's go to slide. So here I have adjusted the title a little bit because I'm going to give you a transatlantic perspective on this crazy word, feminism, which has so many different meanings in different cultures necessarily national cultures. Ukrainian is a different language than Russian. Many of you are studying Russian already, so you probably would understand some Ukrainian. Якщо я говорила по-українськи, ви б знали, що я скажу. You would know what I'm saying if I started to speak Ukrainian, because these languages are mutually intelligible. And working, living, studying in the space of Ukraine has been one of the most fascinating, intellectually, and challenging on so many levels, personal, professional, experiences of my life. The first time I went to Ukraine was 2004, and I went through the capacity of Peace Corps, which some of you probably have heard about. It's a US government-funded program where individuals can volunteer in any professional capacity, medicine, business, education, in many countries of the world. At that time, in 2003, when I applied, I didn't have the opportunity to choose where I was going to go in the world. You kind of apply and you are given an assignment based on your professional capacity and need of the inviting host countries. So countries around the world invite volunteers, and they reach out to the US government and invite people over. It's not like the government goes out and assigns people. It's an exchange program that happens intragovernmentally. So I was invited to Ukraine to teach English in a small school in western Ukraine called Samir, and I'll get to that in a minute. And I lived in Samir for 2 years and studied Ukrainian while I was there, and really got to engage with the diversity of that region. So Ukraine is a space also with a lot of Polish culture, Armenian culture, Jewish culture, interwoven, just like in the US. We have all of these different languages and backgrounds that we encounter every day. So what was really cool was I was able to connect also with some of my cultural heritage, being Polish. My last name has lots of consonants in it, and most people can't pronounce it, so I just tell them, call me JZ. Yes, those are really my initials. Or Dr. Z, which sounds a little bit crazy and Cold War-like, you know, I'm going to start, I don't know, hacking or something. But anyway, I start with this picture because this is a group of really interesting people in Ukraine that I have encountered. They are an art group, and they started after the Orange Revolution in 2004, right around the time I was in Ukraine. I didn't know them personally at that time. It wasn't until much later when I started researching my dissertation that I got to learn about these different art groups, art collectives, and activist groups, because that's what I ended up writing my book about. But what are they doing here? They're holding up pictures of vaginas over their faces as part of the Women's March that happened on March 8th, so this month, last year in Kiev. And I was a part of just walking through, observing, and interviewing a lot of the people in that march. So you'll see some pictures from that today. That's really the foundation of what I want to share with you today, because this is a really powerful event for Ukrainians. It's very much connected to the history of this day in the Soviet era, which involved a lot of ideological experiments by the Soviet government that have since become, quite controversial as the country moves more and more towards democracy. And in 1991, if those of you, who are studying Russian history already know the fall of the Soviet Union happened in 1991. It also, happened in 1991 throughout all the former Soviet republics. Ukraine was a republic. It was a very strong republic of the Soviet Union. All of the missiles were held there, and they had the highest grossing production of meat, major export of the Soviet Union, and just generally, people were able to live pretty well there during the Soviet period. So through economic collapse after 1981, a lot of questions around rights, around women's rights resurfaced, and those continue to resurface after every major political upheaval. Those questions become even more a part of the public discourse in Ukraine. So a lot of you have seen already in the media in the last couple of years the revolution that happened in Kiev with violence, a violent revolution, and the women's rights were and still are a part of the reform process happening in that country. So returning to the local history is always really important when we're engaging transnationally or interculturally with the idea of feminism, right? Because this idea is very contested in our own country. And that's why I like studying Ukraine, because it is in a way always a reflection on myself and on my communities that I'm a part of here. So I try to be a kind of an anthropologist in my work. And here, this image is very powerful because it's by a painter named Oksana Pavlenko, who lived in the 1920s and was very much a part of a vibrant artistic community, then referring to itself as the avant-garde, the Ukrainian avant-garde, Ukrainian wave of this, expressed in the 20s some folk motifs or more indigenous even ideas and languages, because Ukrainian itself has many different variations spoken throughout the territories of Ukraine, and these variations come through a lot of former tribal identities, like the Hutsuls in the western Carpathian Mountains have some words that don't exist in Russian or in Ukrainian, as we would think of Ukrainian in the formal codified dictionary. So these groups in the 20s were allowed to express some of those local, really local microcultures, and then were killed in the 30s when Stalin came to power. And Stalinism has, such a very, very contested history in the territories of Ukraine because of the requisition of grain that happened under his rule when he came to power. 6 million Ukrainians died of starvation, and this is now officially recognized as of this year by US Congress as a genocide, not as a natural famine, which is what Russia lists, the Russian Federation lists this event as a natural famine. So history, as you can see, is very political, and how it's written by different nations is a part of our work as scholars that we do in engaging with the public and educating around these topics. So Oksana Pavlenko was depicting March 8th, and this became a propaganda poster in the 20s when she was celebrated along with her contemporaries, but then things changed. The regime turned, and feminism, the woman's question, was very subversive in Stalinism, and people could be attacked and killed for their ideas and killed for bringing forward things that only a decade prior had been applauded by the regime. So it's always very important to know what you stand for and to think about, how you are, engaging an idea with another culture. So this is another picture from the Women's March last year in Kiev that I attended, and you can see the Parliament building in the left. This poster here says, no slavery in the future, равенство, slavery having some local connotations with the history of serfdom in the region. And all of these posters you can see, if you really zeroed in, have many different languages. So this was a very international event. There were Americans there other than myself, and I'll show you some more photos in a minute. And some of the slogans were quite global, like here, "Moi tilo, moi dilo." Who knows what this means? Who can translate for us? It's pretty straightforward, easy translation. Anybody want to try? Yeah.
My tilo, my idea, my body, my business.
Yes. Yeah. My body, my business. My body, my rights. So this is a quite international slogan. Here we see some campaign posters in English. Also the international sign for feminism. This circle with cross symbol on the cheek of a demonstrator on the right. Here's a more local image of a babushka, babusia, with the headscarf, and her sign here says patriarchy, almost like she's controlling, or she's like kind of shaking her finger at patriarchy, saying, I'm the boss, or I can be just as strong as a patriarch. This is how I interpret this particular sign. Here, some more international symbols appear, and you can see the presence of the police in this image is quite visible with the very heavy padded right here. You can't quite see their helmets, I think, from the glare, but the thing is that I want you to see the amount of presence of security around this event, because it did not start out as such a celebratory event. In 2008, when the first Women's March happened in Ukraine, there were only 8 people there, and it was heavily guarded by police, and the group organizing it at that time was called Feminist. They were a grassroots feminist group, not an NGO, but there were several people in this group that were working for outside NGOs like Heinrich Böll from Germany, or Insight, which is an LGBT organization in Ukraine, the first one that was founded in Ukraine. And Insight now organizes the Women's March. So it's not only exclusively dedicated to women as a gender or to female as a sexuality. It includes also LGBT groups. But there is also a separate Pride March that happens in Kiev, and I attended that as well, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Here's an elderly woman, very fashionable outfit here. Another image here, this says, does anybody want to translate? Because this one is in Russian.
Feminism. I don't know what you just said.
Translation is hard, especially with protest posters, because they often, just like jokes, have so many multiple meanings, ironies.
It's a line from a song with the word feminist.
Ah, really? A line
Yeah,
from a song? I
Zychowicz.
didn't know that. Which song? What is it?
Утали мои печали, Натали. So it was a woman's name, Nathalie, and they changed it from feminism.
Oh, cool. Great. So I didn't know this song in Russian, and I really love the shirt because it says ambition. It's like very powerful. Here's an image which you can see purple being this international color that we now associate with women's rights and women's marches being used here. And in the Polish language, this sign says, precarious of the world, unite. The precarious of the world, unite. Referring back to the slogan, the proletariat unite, but here it's been replaced with precarious, perhaps referring to the word precariat, which in a lot of social science literature references migration, labor, contract labor, and those who are most vulnerable in society. So this is also a very international element. Here we see a local image of a writer, Lesa Ukrainka, who has become a really important symbol in the women's movement in Ukraine. And she lived basically in the mid-19th century. She worked a lot with another writer named Olha Podolyanska, who spoke German, and they lived in Western Ukraine. They both worked in the city of And what they were doing, they were setting up small local schools for villagers and rural individuals, mostly women, to come and to study. So she, as a poet and an author of her time, very recognized and aided by a male author, Ivan Franko, she made it her life's mission to promote literacy in the Ukrainian language, because a lot of those living in Western Ukraine who were Orthodox worshippers, they were speaking Ukrainian, not Russian or Polish. Poland was the dominant ruling class at that time in Western Ukraine, and most of the education was in Polish. So she also is iconic for Ukraine as a nation right now. Ukraine is going through a lot of nation building after not only the revolution of dignity, which is what the Ukrainians call it, in 2013-14, but also the Orange Revolution of 2004, in which the leadership was viewed as very corrupt, and the populations of Ukraine gathered in Kiev and ousted the leader because they believed the elections had been stolen from them. The meaning and the reasons for the revolution in both cases, 2004 and 2013-14, in both cases entailed a lot of mistrust of the government, not only in the figurehead of the president, but throughout the levels of administration and police. And this continues today still. There is, and I'm sure you've encountered it, a lot of writing and analysis and international discussion about corruption in Ukraine. How to deal with corruption is a huge problem for political scientists right now. There's a political scientist in Canada at the institute I'm working at who has 30 plus years of experience studying Ukraine and Russia. He himself has Ukrainian background. Bogdan Harasimu is his name, if you want to look him up. And he's told me that corruption is so frustrating because you can't quantify it necessarily. It's very difficult to categorize. And for political scientists, this is a big problem. So the Women's March itself, here's some more slogans. This one is also Russian. Anybody want to translate it?
So common sense could be here, or common sense could be perceived?
Yeah, like a space of common sense or common knowledge. The person who gave me these stickers is named Olha Martinyuk, and she was one of the original founders of the Women's March in 2008. She was part of this group, Ofensiva, and she has told me that over the years the march has grown so much. I think now it's up to 7,000 people. She views this as a huge mark of success, and she's been keeping all of the stickers and paraphernalia from all of the marches and is now going to put them in an archive. But what happened last year at the march was something like that really kind of blew my mind. So this poster is a poster by an artist named Dana Kabela, and she has made art for CEDAW, which is the UN organization for the elimination of violence against women, and she has worked with organizations around the world making art for them. This was the poster that she created for the Women's March, and the people standing, holding this poster are standing right in front of City Hall in Kiev, so in a very prominent place. And what happened was some opponents of the march took this to court. Basically, they were able to convince the police to arrest the artist and arrest the poster itself and take the poster to court. They put the poster on trial, not the artist. And this was a very kind of Soviet thing to do, where journals were arrested during the Soviet era for not conforming properly to different parameters set by the state on what you can say and do in public. In this case, the poster was arrested on charges of not complying with the protest laws that were set into effect or signed into action during the Maidan Revolution. They have since been amended several times based on civilian complaints, but there is a law still in the civic legal code of Ukraine that says you cannot use any civic symbols in your protest. Meaning, this yellow symbol on the left, which looks like, it's called a trident, but it looks like Triton's, spear, basically, is a civic symbol, a very neutral symbol in Ukraine. It's used on all documents. It might be somewhat equivalent to the eagle in the US context. And here it appears in a sense of attacking this figure on the poster, and also a cross is featured here. But basically, the opponents of the march cited this code in order to basically delegitimize the marchers, and it became a big discussion on social media. A lot of people were talking about how and why certain symbols are more controversial than others, and maybe this symbol wouldn't matter if it weren't layered onto a nude woman's body, because the woman and a nude woman itself are also and can be considered in some sense as national symbols in different ways. So this became kind of a theoretical question for me in my research, and how things are developing in Ukraine and around feminism and women's rights. What people are saying is interesting to trace the debate, because this year the artist created another poster. She decided to continue her kind of provocation, and this one is really a reference, obvious reference to the war that is taking place in the territories of eastern Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine. You can see the alignment or the layers of reproduction, giving birth, and sending soldiers to war. There is a long and very interesting tradition in Slavic cultures, especially during and after World War II, of using motherhood in the context of protest for different women's issues, or even making anti-war statements. And this is not unique to Ukraine. We see this in cultures around the world. Without giving my own interpretation of how I feel about this image, or don't feel, I can say that studies have shown that the use of motherhood in the context of protest can sometimes have very unintended consequences on behalf of the demonstrators. So in the Polish context, there were instances in 1968 and then again in 1989, anti-communist protests by Polish demonstrators who were women, who were using the figure of motherhood and felt themselves to be very pacifist. But then later on, this same figure of motherhood was underwritten into Polish justifications and legitimizing of a certain nationalism that those demonstrators did not want. So it's a very slippery slope. Images what I want to point out is that images, this one and also this image here, and symbols, have very interesting properties because they can be interpreted in opposite ways. You can't make the same kind of stance or rhetorical gesture through an image that you might be able to with a protest slogan. And this is something I think about and work on quite a bit in my book in terms of looking at art and feminism. I don't want to read into the images of politics that doesn't exist. I want to understand the utterances and the gestures of the artists and the cultures in which I find the image. It's kind of more of a detective or forensics type of methodology that I use rather than imposing ideology. Here I include this picture because it gives a sense of the very serious context of the women's demonstration and how all different elements of society in this post-revolutionary space are reading into the march, like you might read into an image, different kind of political gestures. The EU here is a symbol that oftentimes local, I guess, ideas or associations of what a right or left politics might be view in the context of gender because they view the word feminism as an import coming from the West, coming from the EU, and not as an indigenous or local idea, which is counter to what we know about the debates that were happening in the Soviet period around the women's question, that there were ideas already in society around feminism. It's not an import, it's just a construction right now that exists in this framework that feminism, LGBT rights are left, and coming from gay Europa, from the West, and everything else is indigenous. We should protect the church. And this has a history also in the discourse of Slavophiles in the philosophies from the 19th century that probably you have encountered in your classes in Russian literature. But in practice, sociologists are pointing out the fact that you cannot necessarily map a left and a right when you're talking about gender. And it's often the case that people forget, well, there are conservatives who are gay, there are people on the left who are straight, that these things, gender identity and sexuality, are not always politicized in the way they are manipulated by the political regime. So here you see also the far right and the police presence at the march, and more of society, local society, politics, bringing church politics into the march, because this year has been a major turning point within the Orthodox world, with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the patriarch of the Ukrainian segment of the Orthodox Church breaking away from the Russian patriarch of the Orthodox Church. So the church has been very important to discourse throughout the entire post-Soviet world this year, because this is a major shift in theological dogma and also in the politics of the cultures and the societies that are part of that world. Here's another demonstrator. So again, we see the nation, the flag of Ukraine, superimposed by the symbols of the Orthodox Ukrainian Church, and for this individual, these two things are the same. As well as a priest here. This is a very controversial image, and was everywhere in social media because this individual here is a homeless man who was recruited by an unknown source to hold a sign in the march, and when he was interviewed, he did not know why he was there or what he was doing or even what was going on around him. And this sign says, "Against lesbian separatism," which is a quite advanced gender concept, even for those of us who may be very familiar with the history of women's rights, because lesbian separatism is controversial even for those who maybe call themselves or identify themselves as feminists. The lesbian separatists were a group represented by the Lavender Menace in the US context in the 70s and 80s, and they were arguing for a complete break away from the feminist movement as it stood then, because they were saying we should not have any heterosexuality in our movement. It should be only lesbianism. We are separating away. And in this context, the local context in Ukraine, the word separatism has another meaning, because you see this word a lot in Ukrainian media about the war, where the interpretation of whether the occupied territories of formerly autonomous Ukrainian Donbas region, if the people there who are calling themselves the DNR, the Donbas National Republic, are they separatists? Are they terrorists? Are they occupying Russian forces? Depending on who you're talking to, they are none in all of these things. So the word separatism here is, in the local context, really controversial. I think that's why whoever gave this homeless man to hold this sign is using this term, not because they know anything about lesbian separatism, but because it's a coded provocation to delegitimize the Women's March and to poke at the nation as it's going through this trauma involving the war in the East. So it's a very complex space to be in Ukraine and working through some of these layers. Something that is not new about this situation is that the political technologies for the production of media production and sort of the managed democracy where people are paid to protest, this is not new in the post-Soviet world. It's been going on for as long as autocracies have existed, where campaigns are paid for and protests is never quite as it seems. So it's good to in your research and future work, hopefully in any exchanges you go on or study abroad programs, that you are really thinking through the history and the layers of what you see in this space, because it's not the same as what we have and what we are familiar with here. But it's inspiring also because of what people have lived through in this part of the world and how creative they've had to be. For example, here's an image from an artist, Meyer Friedrich, who is from Wrocław, Poland, and he created a movement called the Orange Alternative, where he and all of his fellow artists would dress up like doors, orange doors, and run through the streets. So that is also the same spirit in which the artists I started with the vaginas over their faces, are working, and they're using humor to get around some of the more cynical appropriations of their right to demonstrate or to have a voice. They're using humor in very positive and unifying ways. So in that spirit, here's another image from an artist named Alberta, who uses humor and also her mother's life story to tell her experience of the war in the East. She travels quite a bit to visit her mother, who still lives in the occupied zone, and grows strawberries there. Her name is Strawberry Andreevna, which is the nickname that her students gave her because she's a kindergarten school teacher. And here's just some more images from her comic book that Alberta created about her mom's experience, but also her own experience in the revolution. She made something like 500 drawings. And here are some more drawings of the revolution and the war by different artists, but also in a graphic novel called Kiev Diary. And all of the images, I think 343 of them, are available online. You can view them all for free at this site, kievdiary.kniazahora.com. And I will give these slides to your instructor so you can follow up if you're interested. But I wanted to be sure to get to some other images before we open up for questions. This is another painting by the same artist I mentioned earlier, Oksana Pavlenko. As you can see, the year is 1932. It was banned. This painting never made it to the public because the regime thought it was not appropriate to show to the public, that the women's question was too subversive. Stalin was not going to put up with the same level of liberal discussion, perhaps, that was permitted before this time period. Right now, in Ukraine, is the first time that anybody can access the secret archives that were previously sealed off from researchers. Ukraine is the first post-Soviet republic to open up its archives of the secret police to researchers. And these archives include all of the paintings that were banned by the regime. This is another one of them. And it was interesting to me to look at some of these paintings because I couldn't really understand why they were banned in the first place. This one is showing a very anti-capitalist position that seems quite banal, actually, if we know how the Soviets felt about capitalism. This kind of conforms to their ideologies. But it was banned, and so was this painting of pogrom. These were all deemed controversial at the time, and this one I think is also a reference to same-sex desire, which was definitely banned by the Soviets. Ukraine was the first republic to decriminalize homosexuality, but today things are very different. I was just debating this with my friend actually. Homosexuality is not illegal in Ukraine, nor is it illegal in Russia by any official decree. However, there is a propaganda law in both places that functions in different ways to allow for forms of censorship, of art, of writing, of expressions that maybe could be assumed as homosexual. So in this sense, there is a way in which the law is interpreted that creates forms of discrimination in society. So here I have my contact information, and I would love to hear from you guys about your thinking, or maybe even your plans if you guys want to go abroad or thinking about going on an exchange program. It would be really, really awesome to talk to you because I've gone through Peace Corps and Fulbright, and I would really, really love to be able to answer questions or support or advocate for your ideas if you have them. So I would love to hear from you. If any of you guys have questions, just raise your hand. I will try my best to see you. Yes?
When you attended the Women's March in 2018, was there a specific like primary age group that attended, or was it like throughout like different age groups, or was it just one specific?
That's a good question. I would say, yeah, it was mostly people in their 20s and 30s. And in the Pride March, that was even more the case. And when I spoke with some of the organizers about why, I asked why, they told me that there is a danger, a real threat posed in the Pride March, even more so than the Women's March, in which people need to run if they're attacked. This year, several embassies lent their support to the Kiev city administration to plan for the march, to plan for the security around the march. So I'm talking about the LGBT, the Pride March. When I was walking through the crowd, I saw police forces 7 or 8 lines deep on both sides. And behind those police forces, I saw the opposition. And it was scary. It felt like if you could not run, you probably shouldn't be in the march, because It wasn't a celebratory kind of event. It was a very politicized event, and some of the ambassadors, like the Swedish ambassador, had also made a post on YouTube in an unofficial capacity, as walking with the marchers in solidarity. And this also lent another layer, I think, of security, because to have a crowd that includes officials, government officials, it can create a kind of diplomatic immunity that protects people. So in this sense, that's another reason I think why there were a lot of people in their 20s and 30s versus elderly or very young people. Yeah. More questions? Yeah.
I'm a little bit interested in the rejection of feminism as a Western idea. I want to know what's the initial thought of having the first women's march, in terms of opposition.
Definitely. This is a great question, and I'm not the only person who has looked at this. So for further reading, I can also recommend Oksana Kij, spelled K-I-S, that's her last name, and Catherine Verdery, Verdery. Both of these scholars I cite in my own work who are looking at the same question. And what Oksana writes, from the local perspective, is really connected to labor equality, that in the Ukrainian context, even more than the Polish context, which I've studied in depth, the concerning questions of the past 10 years have really been about representation in political and labor terms. In 2013, the National Academy of Sciences, which is the academic organization in Ukraine that is funded by the government and employs professors, there were 147 male academics and 3 women. Only 3. That's changed since then, but Oksana writes about that in her piece. So, yeah, it's a big question, but I'm glad you asked it. Yeah. More? Yeah.
So does Ukraine have the same law as Russia that Russia has this recent law, maybe it's not recent, that we talked about decriminalization of domestic violence?
Yes.
So that, does Ukraine have the same
Wait, can you repeat?
decriminalization of domestic violence? So if there is that violence and the woman reports it, then the man just gets away with paying some fine, but there are no consequences whatsoever for that violence. It seems like from your talk, I have a feeling like Ukraine is more progressive. You talk about Pride March. I don't think Russia has a Pride March.
There is, but it's small. I think I've seen it from Dan Healy in his work. Works on political avoidance and history. But yeah, I have the same question about whether, because they have the same anti-gay propaganda law, and that's been very much connected to this kind of decriminalization of domestic violence. Is there a similar move towards pushing women back into the home, pushing women's violence back into the rug, and all those other?
Yeah, in the years between the Orange Revolution in 2004 and the Maidan Revolution of 2013-14, there was on the table an anti-discrimination law. And this law became part of the negotiations between the EU and then President Yanukovych in 2013 around the signing of the association agreement, Ukraine's EU association, not meaning they would join the EU, but that they would get a visa-free travel regime and some trade benefits. Now, what's interesting is Yanukovych had a lot of pressure from Russia not to allow this anti-discrimination bill to go through in those negotiations. He had a lot of pressure also just to not sign the agreement. In 2013, in the lead up to the revolution, this was a big issue for feminist activists this anti-discrimination bill, which had a lot to do with rolling back the violence against women and was connected to many other laws. What happened was basically the EU said, okay, we'll look the other way. You don't have to sign the anti-discrimination law, just sign the association agreement. So he got his way in that sense, but then he refused even to sign the association agreement, which was highly popular. A lot of people in Ukraine wanted him to sign. And this was the spark that led to the student protests and the revolution began. In the wake of that whole violent revolution, everything, one of the outcomes has been that law was signed into effect in 2015, and it has opened up quite a bit of space for NGOs who there are a lot of local NGOs and there are international NGOs working on the question of domestic violence. But it is, as you pointed out, so much about how the police respond and enforce the laws, because I've also heard in parlance, just from speaking to people who are researching this specifically, that in practice it's still the case where the perpetrator of that violence is just sort of given a slap on the wrist. Like the repercussions are not there to the point where I think women feel empowered to speak out and come forward unless they do already have a very strong network. There was a campaign in Ukraine before the #MeToo campaign happened that was almost the exact same in form as the #MeToo campaign. It was called the Я не боюся сказати. I'm not afraid to say. So if you go to #Я не боюся сказати, there you will find a lot of information on this exact question. And you will find a lot of testimonials, and this gives you really a sense of where and how those things have evolved. That campaign is still going today. It's not over. I don't think it ever would be, but it's good to know that it happened, and it happened in Ukraine before it happened here, which is interesting. There is a scholar, Tamara Martineau, who was a Fulbright scholar this past year, based in New York at Columbia University. She's from here, and she was working a little bit with the UN around this, and she, I think, has already written an article. I don't know if it's been translated, but about this question. So her research is also something great to check out, and I'm happy to give you guys references. If you just send me an email, I can give you all this in writing, because I'm probably not going to remember all of it. So yes, a lot is happening. I'm hopeful. I try to always be a glasses half full kind of person on these questions, because I see a lot of bravery. I see a lot of sustained activism by the same people, and it's growing and growing little by little. So that is very, very much hopeful, that people are able to continue their work for 10 years. We're not seeing like a turnover of activists. People are not, being threatened to the point where they're scared off of even pursuing what they believe in. So, yeah.
You had several posters that were speaking to the separatist movement and speaking that. Was there also, I know that there's oftentimes in these protests, working from the Russian perspective, I'd often see kind of a bandwagon effect, that there's one group that's protesting and there'd be a whole. Were there any groups that were there protesting the rising anti-Semitism, any kind of ethnic minority groups that were also part of this feminism march?
Yeah, that's a very important question, especially for this year, because there were attacks targeting Roma groups in Ukraine. And before, some feminists actually went to, and including myself, went to Amnesty International and said, hey, put this on your agenda. It wasn't really part of the local activists' concerns, actually. Like, these are, I'm glad you brought up anti-Semitism too, because there is a neo-Nazi problem in Ukraine. There are real threats, and people have to adapt. Visiting the Amnesty International office was interesting, and kind of put that into perspective for me, because they had basically to move from their other office in Kiev, which was public, to a secret space, and they screened me and everything before I could even enter, because they had received so many threats from neo-Nazi groups, swastikas, because Amnesty International stands for also the amnesty of ethnic minorities, and that was eye-opening because it also showed that there's been a backsliding in Ukraine in some areas, while other things seem to have moved forward, like the LGBT movement and the feminist movement. While it has moved forward, the opponents have also gotten a little bit stronger and widened their scope. So it's complicated in that sense. And within, I don't want to promote the idea that there's some unified feminist front or LGBTQ front, because within these movements there's a lot of fractioning and debate, and not all groups are represented equally. In Kiev, it's very interesting because you have spaces for socialization for gay men, but not lesbians. And this really bothers the lesbian community. It also bothers some gay men too, actually, because why is it only that one group within the rainbow gets the privilege of some kind of space and the others don't, and how much can equality be built even within that movement? So this is an interesting effect. There were some other pictures that I had that I wanted to show you. Maybe they didn't make it into this particular video. I'll have to send any of you who are interested in seeing more pictures for your own research. I have a lot of things that I can share with you or help you out with. So a lot of first-hand material on this, and again, things are always changing, so you can never take anything at face value without going farther and kind of really seeing what's on the ground. There are many great NGOs like Amnesty International, but also a lot of German NGOs working in Ukraine. The German Ministry of Culture has done incredible work on anti-Semitism in Ukraine. Actually, they are really doing more, I would say, than the U.S. contact. The U.S. Embassy can do more. That's my complaint as U.S. The U.S. can do more, not sense, yeah.
And that's, I think, a major distinction between Ukraine and Russia, that Ukraine has such a presence of foreign NGOs, whereas Russia bans them. I mean, there is this Yarovaya law, Amy knows about it, that censors, prohibits the work of foreign organizations like Jehovah's Witnesses or, I don't know, just the recent arrests. So there is expulsion of the foreign organizations, and it's quite damages the attempt to bring some sort of justice to the people that need help because government doesn't give them. So Yarovaya law, or this crazy law that the Russian president wants to implement to shut off the internet, where, I mean, Ukraine doesn't move in that way. I mean, there is some sort of sanity.
Yeah, so, definitely. But what is interesting in Ukraine, trust also is still very much a limited resource. It's a very precious resource that needs to be built, especially if you are a foreigner. You can still be perceived as an agent of some kind by average Ukrainians. It's still very, very much like a challenge to gain trust between yourself and individuals sometimes. And along with that, I would also say that in those terms, Russia is also a presence in Ukraine, and Ukrainians, not only Ukrainians, but other foreigners, everyone, there's even a paranoia around Russian agents working in Ukraine to create some kind of confusion. If this is the case in the US, we see the media, let's be honest. There's an element of the Cold War in this, and something that I think is really powerful about education, about language, learning languages, is if you do not speak the local language and you're not speaking to locals in the local language, you will never gain that trust, because you won't understand what people are going through if you're only speaking English and only working in your own discursive context. So just to be able to have a conversation and understand one another is a breakthrough in the fact that not so long ago our worlds were really walled off, and how we can prevent that from ever happening again, I think is ultimately the main idea, or what drives me to study feminism and to continue returning to this part of the world, because it is interesting. And I have a lot of feminist friends who I haven't met yet who are there. The picture I wanted to show you actually was my friend Jenny from Arkansas, who was in the Peace Corps with me back in 2004, and she's now living and working in Washington, D.C. for the Peace Corps. And she has since also worked in Africa in the capacity of public health. So that's been also why I'm really excited to be here. And I have a question for you. Where should I go in Arkansas? What would you recommend that I see here?
Bristol Bridges,
Yeah, okay, it's on the agenda already. I have a good hostess here.
trails, take a bike and just go
Oh, yeah.
down the trails.
We have lots of really great state parks. Like Devil's Den is actually like 15 minutes off the highway.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, if you want
What is Devil's Den a national? It's a park, national park.
It's a very pretty place.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah. I came from Edmonton, where I survived a negative 40-degree Fahrenheit winter. So just to walk outside in the sun is good enough for me. Yeah.
Good, so let's think, well,